The night was alive with grandeur. A spectacular gala was unfolding in the heart of Beverly Hills, where only the most privileged of society had been invited. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of architecture, towering over the sprawling landscape like a monument to wealth and influence. Nestled behind towering iron gates and a winding marble driveway, the estate stood as an untouchable sanctuary for the elite. From the outside, the mansion exuded an almost mythical presence, its intricate stone carvings and massive Grecian columns whispering of old money and prestige. Inside, the ballroom gleamed under the glow of an extravagant Swarovski crystal chandelier, its cascading light refracting across the domed ceiling like a million tiny diamonds. The air was filled with the soft hum of a live symphony orchestra, their violins weaving an elegant melody that intertwined effortlessly with the gentle clinking of champagne flutes. The guest list was exclusive. Invites had been sent only to the wealthiest CEOs, socialites, and celebrities. Names that often graced the pages of Forbes and Vogue were now gathered under one roof, their laughter and whispers filling the golden-hued hall. Yet, despite the extravagance of the event, there was a peculiar mystery surrounding the night. The host of this grand affair had remained completely anonymous. No one knew their identity, only that they were someone of extraordinary wealth and power. Speculations ran wild. Was it an oil tycoon? A Silicon Valley magnate? A Hollywood mogul? Some theorized it was a billionaire seeking to test the boundaries of high society, watching silently as the elite mingled, oblivious to their benefactor's presence. As guests arrived in their finest attire, one thing was certain. Tonight was destined to be an unforgettable evening, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Everything about the party exuded opulence. The grand staircase leading into the main ballroom was lined with red velvet, each step polished to perfection, reflecting the golden glow of the chandeliers above. Towering floral arrangements of rare orchids and deep crimson roses stood as centerpieces, their intoxicating scent mingling with the faint aroma of aged cognac and imported caviar. The waitstaff, dressed in tailored black and white uniforms, moved with precise coordination, balancing silver trays of the finest hors d'oeuvres, truffle-infused delicacies, gold-flaked chocolates, and freshly shucked oysters flown in from the French coast just hours before. The Dom Perignon flowed endlessly, poured into crystal glasses that sparkled under the soft, ambient lighting. At the far end of the ballroom, a string quartet played a delicate arrangement of Mozart and Chopin, their music melting into the lively chatter of the guests. Everywhere, conversations danced through the air, investments, summer retreats in Monaco, whispers of multi-million-dollar deals happening behind closed doors. The attendees were the epitome of high society, draped in designer gowns and tailored Armani suits. Women wore Cartier necklaces and Tiffany diamonds, their fingers adorned with rings that caught the light at every turn. Men walked with an effortless confidence, the scent of Tom Ford and Creed colognes trailing behind them. It was a world reserved for those born into privilege, those who had never known struggle, those who assumed their superiority was a given, rather than a luxury. Among the sea of privileged elites, a young woman stepped through the entrance. Naomi Carter. She was stunning, dressed in a flowing black gown that shimmered with every step she took, the fabric hugging her figure in a way that spoke of effortless elegance. Her smooth, deep brown skin contrasted beautifully with the diamonds that glistened against her collarbone, catching the light as she moved. She wore her hair in a sleek, low bun, her makeup subtle yet refined, a perfect blend of sophistication and confidence. As Naomi entered the mansion, her breath hitched for a moment. Despite having attended her fair share of events, the sheer grandeur of this one was overwhelming. Everything about this place radiated power and exclusivity. Her eyes scanned the room, absorbing the sparkling chandeliers, the rows of champagne glasses, the effortless poise of the socialites as they laughed and whispered behind gloved hands. For a brief second, she let herself admire it all, the kind of wealth that people only dreamed about, the kind that felt untouchable. But she shook it off quickly. She had every right to be here. Taking a deep breath, she stepped further into the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. Though she moved with confidence, there was a quiet wariness in her expression. She had attended events like this before, ones where the unspoken rules were clearer than any written invitation. Money wasn't the only currency here. Status, family name, and power were equally important. And while Naomi had earned her success through grit and intelligence, she knew that to some of these people, she would always be an outsider. Still, she wasn't about to let that intimidate her. As Naomi moved deeper into the ballroom, the shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The casual elegance in the room suddenly felt calculated. The whispers grew quieter, subtle glances flickered toward her, assessing, questioning. Some guests barely concealed their confusion. Others made no attempt to hide their disdain. A group of older women, dressed in shimmering Oscar de la Renta gowns, exchanged knowing looks, their expressions tightening in disapproval. Near the champagne tower, a man in a sharp Brioni suit leaned toward his companion, murmuring under his breath. Naomi didn't need to hear the words to understand the sentiment. To them, she didn't belong. She caught the eyes of an older gentleman, someone she recognized from a Wall Street Journal cover, and offered a polite nod. He barely acknowledged her before turning away, already engaging someone else in conversation. A blonde woman, dripping in Van Cleef and Arpels jewelry, whispered something to her friend, and both of them let out soft, condescending laughs. Naomi's lips pressed together, but she refused to let her confidence waver. She had dealt with this before, the quiet exclusion, the subtle message that she was an intruder in their world. What they didn't realize, of course, was the irony. Because Naomi Carter was not just another guest at this party. She owned the mansion they stood in, and before the night was over, they would all find out. Naomi took a deep breath, adjusting the delicate diamond bracelet on her wrist as she strolled toward the grand ballroom. She moved with quiet grace, her steps measured, her head held high, but beneath the surface, she could feel it. The tension, the curiosity, the scrutiny. First, she tried to ignore it. She reached for a glass of Dom Perignon from a passing waiter's tray, nodding politely as she took a sip. The crisp, chilled liquid fizzed against her tongue, a subtle reminder that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. She walked toward a magnificent golden sculpture at the center of the hall, a piece she recognized from an exclusive Sotheby's auction months ago. It was a rare acquisition, one that only a select few had even had the opportunity to bid on. But as she admired it, she felt them, the eyes. Whispers curled through the air like tendrils of smoke, faint but unmistakable. Naomi turned slightly, catching the way conversations hushed when she passed. A group of socialites stood near a grand mahogany bar, their gazes flicking toward her before quickly turning away, murmuring among themselves. "She's not from around here," one woman whispered. Another let out a small chuckle. "No kidding. Look at her. Who even invited her?" Naomi clenched her jaw but forced herself to remain composed. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let something as petty as judgmental stares shake her confidence. She smoothed down the fabric of her designer gown, a custom piece from a renowned black-owned fashion house, and took another sip of champagne. She was here to enjoy the night, and yet the whispers continued. A pair of young men in tailored Tom Ford suits stood near the marble staircase, their voices just loud enough for her to hear. "Maybe she's a +1, one of them mused. The other scoffed. "Doubt it. More like she snuck in." Naomi's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She knew this game well. She had spent years navigating spaces where she was either overlooked or hypervisible, always too much or not enough in the eyes of the privileged few. But tonight, she refused to let them win. She turned toward them, locking eyes with one of the men, and smiled coolly. The confidence in her expression caught him off guard, and he quickly looked away, pretending to check his phone. Naomi exhaled slowly. She would not be intimidated. She took a step forward, ready to immerse herself in the event, when suddenly, a voice, smooth yet sharp, cut through the air. Naomi barely had time to turn before she found herself face to face with Victoria Lancaster. The woman was a legend in the real estate industry, notorious for her cutthroat business deals and a socialite reputation that was as polished as her expensive designer wardrobe. Tonight, She was dressed in an emerald green Givenchy gown, the rich silk pooling elegantly at her feet. A dazzling Cartier necklace graced her collarbone, and her manicured fingers sparkled with diamonds that whispered of old money and privilege. Her blonde hair was swept into a sleek chignon, and she wore the kind of smug expression that only those at the pinnacle of high society could master. Victoria's smile was practiced, perfectly poised, yet beneath it, Naomi could sense something else: condescension. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask Naomi for her name. Instead, she simply tilted her head, surveying Naomi the way one might examine a misplaced object at an otherwise pristine event. And then, with an air of casual arrogance, she spoke. "Are you lost, dear? This is a private event." The words were coded in politeness, but the message was clear. "You don't belong here." For a moment, the entire room seemed to pause. Conversations slowed, champagne flutes hesitated midair, and a quiet ripple of interest spread through the guests. Naomi's heartbeat remained steady, but she could feel the heat of expectation pressing against her skin. They were watching, waiting. Would she shrink? Would she stammer, apologize, slink away? Would she prove them right? Naomi didn't flinch. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, allowing the tension to linger. Then, with a measured grace, she met Victoria's gaze and smiled. "I was invited." Her voice was calm, unwavering, carrying an edge of unshakable confidence. For a brief moment, Victoria's expression faltered. It was subtle, a flicker of surprise, a momentary tightening of her lips, but Naomi saw it, and she relished it. Around them, whispers swelled. "Who is she?" someone muttered. "I don't recognize her," another added. Victoria recovered quickly, her carefully curated expression slipping back into place. She let out a small, amused chuckle, as if Naomi's response had been adorable, quaint. Then, with the kind of exaggerated patience one uses with a child, she tilted her head and let out a soft sigh. "Oh, darling," she purred, eyes gleaming with amusement. "I think there's been a mistake." Her voice dripped with passive-aggressive politeness, the kind that could cut deeper than outright cruelty. Naomi arched an eyebrow. "A mistake?" Victoria chuckled lightly, shaking her head. "I mean, this is a very select gathering. We don't usually have—" She waved her manicured hand in the air, as if searching for the right word. "Unfamiliar faces at events like this." The air grew thick with silent judgment. Some guests smirked. Others sipped their champagne, pretending not to watch, but Naomi could feel their attention. Victoria gave a sympathetic sigh, leaning in slightly. "Perhaps you should check with the staff," she suggested, lowering her voice just enough to add a quiet insult. "They might be able to help you." The message was clear. She thought Naomi was a server. The realization burned hot in Naomi's chest, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she smiled, because Victoria Lancaster had no idea what was coming next. Victoria's smile didn't falter, but there was a dangerous glint in her eyes, the kind that said she wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she had already deemed beneath her. She let out a small, amused sigh, then, without breaking eye contact with Naomi, subtly lifted two fingers, a barely noticeable gesture. But Naomi noticed, and so did security. From the far end of the ballroom, a tall, broad-shouldered bouncer in a crisp black suit took his cue. He was built like a linebacker, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency. The guests around Naomi subtly shifted, parting just enough to clear a path for him, like predators retreating to let the enforcer handle the trespasser. Naomi, sensing the change in atmosphere, kept her expression unreadable. She wasn't surprised. She had seen this happen before, how the elite wielded their influence without raising their voices, without causing a scene. It was all about subtlety. The right people knew when to step in, and those in power never had to dirty their own hands. And yet, despite expecting it, something about this moment stung. Not because of the bouncer, not because of the silent agreement among the guests, but because of the absolute certainty that Victoria had when she called security. Victoria didn't think Naomi belonged. She didn't think Naomi could belong, and she had no doubt, none at all, that Naomi would be escorted out like some nameless intruder, and the night would continue as if she had never existed. The bouncer stopped in front of Naomi. His expression was neutral, professional. But the weight of the situation was heavy. And then he spoke. "Ma'am, we'll have to escort you out. This is an exclusive event." His voice was low, controlled, but there was no mistaking the finality in his words. Naomi inhaled slowly. She had two choices. She could let them drag her out, let them win, let them reduce her to exactly what they wanted her to be. An outsider, a mistake, an embarrassment to be erased. Or she could stand her ground. She met the bouncer's gaze, calm and unshaken. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said smoothly. There was a brief hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, as if something in Naomi's tone suggested she wasn't just another guest. But before he could react, Victoria let out a light, patronizing laugh. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, shaking her head as if she pitied Naomi. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. These events are, well, let's just say they require a certain level of exclusivity." Her voice was dripping with condescension, the kind that wasn't even trying to hide what it really meant. Naomi clenched her jaw. She knew what Victoria was doing, humiliating her in front of everyone, making a spectacle out of her removal. And it was working. All around her, guests were whispering, some chuckling softly into their champagne glasses, others outright smirking. To them, she wasn't just an unwelcome guest anymore. She was entertainment. Naomi's pulse quickened, but she refused to let them see it. Instead, she took a step forward, her gaze locked onto Victoria's. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady. Victoria's eyes sparkled with amusement, as if Naomi's defiance was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. The laughter in the room grew, not loud, but pointed. Someone near the gold-plated bar chuckled, muttering, "This is getting embarrassing." A man in a midnight blue Armani tuxedo leaned toward his companion. "Who does she think she is?" he whispered, though not softly enough. Another woman, older, draped in pearls and old-money arrogance, let out a delicate scoff. "Poor thing. She actually thinks arguing will help." Naomi felt the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her posture strong, her expression unreadable. This wasn't the first time she had been in a room where people assumed she wasn't supposed to be. But this was blatant. This was a performance. And Victoria was loving it. The real estate mogul smiled, tilting her head as if Naomi was some amusing little spectacle. Then, with the air of someone delivering a final, crushing blow, she spoke. "Victoria smirks. Perhaps the kitchen staff entrance is more suited for you." The gasps were soft, scattered, but present. Even among the privileged elite, there were moments when the line was pushed too far. And this was one of them. For a fraction of a second, the room hesitated. Naomi's stomach tightened. Not because she was hurt. No, she had heard far worse in her life. But because of the absolute ease with which Victoria said it. The way she had dismissed Naomi without a second thought, as if she wasn't even worth pretending to respect. As if her presence, her very existence in this space, was nothing more than a mistake to be corrected. And worst of all, the laughter started again. A man in a navy velvet blazer let out a chuckle, shaking his head. That was cold. One of the younger guests, a model with high cheekbones and a sharp smirk, sipped her champagne. "She does have a point, though." Victoria simply smiled, pleased with herself, waiting for Naomi to finally accept defeat and leave. But she didn't. Instead, Naomi Carter laughed. It was soft at first, just a small exhale, but then it grew warm, rich, amused. Victoria's smirk faltered. The room went silent again. And that's when Naomi finally spoke. "That's funny," she mused, tilting her head. "Because last time I checked, the owner of this mansion doesn't need to use the back entrance." And just like that, the night changed forever. The tension in the room was palpable. The bouncer, still standing firmly in front of Naomi, was now waiting, his massive frame blocking her from moving any further into the ballroom. He wasn't rough, but his presence alone sent a clear message. This was over. Time to leave. Victoria, still basking in the glow of her humiliating jab, watched Naomi with a satisfied smirk, her perfectly manicured fingers swirling the champagne in her crystal flute. To her, this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a hiccup in her otherwise flawless evening. She had dealt with ambitious outsiders before, people who thought they could slip into this world, people who believed that confidence alone could make them equals. But Victoria knew better. Money, real money, old money, that was what mattered here. And Naomi Carter? She was about to be forgotten. The bouncer reached out, a firm but professional hand on Naomi's elbow. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to." But before he could finish, a sudden rush of movement erupted from the far side of the ballroom. A woman in a sleek black dress, a clipboard clutched tightly in her manicured hands, was sprinting toward them. Her heels clicked furiously against the polished marble floor, her breath ragged, her face flushed with panic. Every guest within earshot turned, eyes widening at the sheer urgency of her approach. The bouncer hesitated. Even Victoria's smirk wavered. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the woman burst through the gathered crowd, her voice sharp and frantic. "Stop immediately. She's the owner of this mansion." For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The words hung in the air, so absurd, so impossible, that the entire ballroom seemed to freeze in time. The bouncer's hand fell away from Naomi's arm as if it had been burned. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, sharp, disbelieving, followed by a stunned silence that swallowed the entire room. Victoria's smile vanished. Her fingers, once poised so elegantly around her champagne flute, now tensed, her knuckles turning white as the realization began to sink in. And Naomi? Naomi simply stood there, calm, steady, untouched by the storm unraveling around her. For the first time that night, she was the one watching them. The event organizer, still breathless, adjusted her dress, trying to regain some composure before turning to the guests. Her voice now urgent but composed. "Ms. Carter owns this estate," she repeated, glancing at the security team. "She's not a guest. She's not an intruder. She's the sole owner of this mansion." A heavy stillness settled over the ballroom, the kind that only happened when everything people thought they knew had just shattered before their eyes. No one knew what to say. The wealthy elite, the who's who of high society, the same people who had laughed, whispered, judged, now stood frozen, caught in the weight of their own arrogance. A waiter, mid-pour, let champagne overflow onto a guest's hand, too distracted to notice. A woman in a deep blue Dior gown blinked rapidly, as if her brain refused to process what she had just heard. A man in an expensive three-piece suit muttered, "That can't be right." But it was. And Victoria? For the first time in years, Victoria Lancaster was speechless. Her cheeks burned, her lips parted slightly, as if trying to find some way to argue against reality itself. But there was no escape. There was no argument, because the truth had already been spoken. Naomi Carter owned this mansion, and now every single person in that room knew it. For a woman who had built her career on control and calculated precision, Victoria Lancaster had never felt more exposed. The blood drained from her face so fast that for a fleeting moment, it looked as though she might faint. Her fingers trembled slightly around the delicate stem of her champagne flute, her once arrogant smirk now completely erased. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was humiliation, a complete public unraveling of the authority she had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago. Her carefully crafted social dominance had just been shattered in front of an audience that mattered most. Her peers, her rivals, the very people who had once admired and feared her presence. And now they were watching her fall. The whispers in the room were no longer about Naomi. They were about her. Did she seriously try to throw out the owner of the mansion? Oh my God, Victoria's never going to live this down. You'd think someone in real estate would bother to know who owns the damn house. Victoria's throat tightened. She had spent decades ensuring her name was untouchable in this world. A mogul, a power player, someone who commanded respect without having to ask for it. And yet, in a matter of seconds, she had lost it all, not to a competitor, not to a business scandal, but to her own arrogance. Her gaze flicked to Naomi, but she immediately regretted it. Because Naomi Carter wasn't angry. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't upset. She was amused. Naomi took her time. She let the silence stretch, let the tension settle deep into the bones of the guests who had mocked her, who had whispered behind their glasses, who had so confidently assumed they were above her. And then, she smirked. Not just a polite smile, not a forced grin. A knowing, slow, calculated smirk that radiated absolute, unshakable power. She crossed her arms over her chest, shifting her weight slightly as she tilted her head, her gaze locking onto Victoria with the kind of calm confidence that made the other woman visibly shrink. Surprised. The single word rippled through the room, hitting harder than any long-winded speech ever could. It wasn't just a question. It was a statement, a challenge, a mirror held up to every single person in that room, forcing them to confront the truth of their own prejudices, their own assumptions, their own failure to see beyond their narrow worldview. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, to deny, to claw back some form of control. But there was nothing she could say. Not now. Not when the damage was already irreversible. And Naomi? Naomi just stood there, letting it all sink in. Because tonight she had won. The event organizer, still slightly breathless from her earlier sprint, took a step forward, her voice now measured and firm. Ms. Carter recently purchased this estate after selling her tech company, Carter Innovations. If the room had been stunned before, it was now absolutely speechless. Carter Innovations. The name echoed like a thunderclap, rolling through the minds of every guest who had dismissed Naomi as an outsider just moments ago. They knew that name. Even if they didn't recognize Naomi herself, they knew that name. The tech world's rising empire. The startup that had disrupted Silicon Valley. The multimillion-dollar company that had recently made headlines for a historic buyout deal. That was her company. That was her success. And she had just cashed out big. A man near the bar swallowed audibly, clearly scrambling to connect the dots in his head. A woman in a silver gown, who had been one of the loudest whisperers earlier, now looked mortified, her eyes darting anywhere but at Naomi. Even the waitstaff, many of whom had been trained to remain invisible, couldn't help but steal stunned glances at the woman who had just shifted the entire power dynamic of the night. Victoria, who had built her empire in luxury real estate, who prided herself on knowing every major player in the industry, had just publicly tried to throw out the very woman who owned one of the most sought-after mansions in Beverly Hills. Naomi let the moment linger. Then, she exhaled softly. A slow, deliberate sigh of someone who had seen this coming from a mile away, and as she glanced around the room, at the shame, the disbelief, the dawning horror on their faces, she felt something deep, something satisfying settle in her chest. Tonight they had judged her. Tonight they had laughed at her. Tonight they had underestimated her. And now, they would never make that mistake again. It's funny, isn't it? You assumed I didn't belong, but in reality you are guests in my home. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was dead silent. No whispered gossip. No clinking champagne glasses. No forced laughter behind gloved hands. Just an overwhelming stillness. The weight of their own humiliation pressing down on them like an invisible force. And at the center of it all, Naomi Carter stood tall, her presence now impossible to ignore. She let her words settle, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the shame-faced expressions of the very people who had mocked her, questioned her presence, assumed she was less than them. She saw the subtle shifts in posture, the nervous tugs at expensive gowns, the uncomfortable shuffling of handmade Italian loafers against the pristine marble floor. And then she turned her attention to Victoria Lancaster. Victoria, who just minutes ago had been the queen of this room, the one leading the mockery, was now standing rigid, her face an unreadable mask of pride and panic. Her carefully composed arrogance had cracked. Naomi could see it in the way her fingers gripped her champagne glass just a little too tightly, in the way her perfectly manicured nails dug into the crystal stem as if holding onto it would keep her world from collapsing around her. Naomi let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough for everyone to truly absorb what had just happened. Then, she tilted her head slightly, her voice smooth and unwavering. "It's funny, isn't it?" The question was soft, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of every ounce of judgment, every whisper, every smug glance thrown her way that night. She took a slow step forward, watching Victoria's throat tighten. "You assumed I didn't belong." Another step. Victoria stiffened, her fingers flexing, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. "But in reality," Naomi exhaled softly, letting a slow smirk curl at the edge of her lips, "you are guests in my home." A sharp inhale rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock, mortification, and the slow, dawning horror of their own arrogance. Someone near the back let out a nervous cough. A woman in an Oscar de la Renta gown, one of the first to whisper about Naomi when she entered, lowered her gaze, suddenly finding her diamond bracelet very interesting. Naomi didn't need to say anything else. She had already won. The moment was already bad enough for Victoria. She could feel the heat creeping up her neck, the realization that she had just made the biggest mistake of her social career slowly suffocating her. And then, fate decided to twist the knife a little deeper. From the corner of the room, a waiter, young, clearly nervous, his hands shaking just a bit too much as he balanced a silver tray of wine glasses, took a step backward. Unfortunately for him, he didn't see the uneven tile beneath his foot. His shoe caught. He stumbled, and in a cruel, perfectly timed moment of karma, the tray tilted sharply, sending a glass of rich, deep red wine flying straight toward Victoria. The room collectively gasped. The moment seemed to unfold in slow motion, the wine arcing through the air, the horror flashing across Victoria's face as she realized what was about to happen, the sheer helplessness of knowing there was nothing she could do to stop it. Then, splash. The expensive Bordeaux crashed into the pristine white silk of Victoria's Chanel gown, soaking through the fabric like a spreading stain of poetic justice. For a second, no one moved. The waiter froze, his face a portrait of absolute terror, his entire career flashing before his eyes. Victoria's mouth opened slightly, as if trying to comprehend what had just happened to her. And then, a sharp, piercing gasp ripped from her throat. Her hands flew to her dress, fingers desperately trying to brush away the wine, but it was useless. The stain had already seeped deep, ruining the delicate designer fabric in a way that no amount of dry cleaning could ever fix. Someone near the back of the room snickered, quickly stifling it behind a cough. Another guest, one of Victoria's so-called allies, turned slightly, her lips twitching in an effort to suppress a smirk. The laughter, small, stifled, but undeniably present, spread through the ballroom like a slow-building storm. Victoria's cheeks burned, her eyes flickering wildly between the guests, searching for some kind of salvation, some way to regain control of the night. But there was no way out. And worst of all, Naomi hadn't even moved. She was still standing there, watching, her smirk unchanged, as if the universe itself had decided to hand-deliver karma on a silver platter. Victoria gritted her teeth, her pride screaming at her to stay composed, to salvage whatever dignity she had left. But Naomi wasn't done yet. Naomi inhaled deeply, fully taking in the moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she turned toward the same bouncer who had tried to throw her out earlier. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout. Her next words were calm, effortless, filled with the quiet, undeniable weight of authority. "Escort her out." The room shuddered with a fresh wave of tension. The bouncer hesitated, his earlier instincts battling against the reality that had just unfolded before him. But in the end, Naomi was the owner of this mansion, and that meant her word was final. With a subtle nod, he stepped forward, his towering presence looming over Victoria, his meaning clear. Victoria's eyes widened, her throat tightening as the realization sank in. "No," she whispered, her voice low, barely audible. This couldn't be happening. She had spent years ensuring she would never be on this side of humiliation. But now, in her most devastating moment, she had been reduced to nothing, and she knew it. The bouncer's hand extended toward her. "Ms. Lancaster," he said, his voice firm, "let's not make a scene." But the scene had already been made. Victoria clenched her jaw, her face pale, her body rigid with humiliated fury. The same guests who had once worshipped her presence were now watching her fall. Some in shock, others in satisfaction, but all of them seeing her for what she truly was. Not the queen of the night, not the ruler of the elite, just another fool who had underestimated the wrong woman. With no other choice, Victoria turned sharply, her ruined Chanel dress dragging behind her, her dignity in tatters. And as the doors to the grand ballroom closed behind her, Naomi Carter finally let herself smile, because tonight justice had been served. As the heavy double doors slammed shut behind Victoria Lancaster, the ballroom remained eerily silent. The once glamorous evening, filled with whispers of power and exclusivity, now felt like a courtroom where everyone had just witnessed a reckoning. Naomi stood at the center of it all, poised, calm, completely unshaken. Every eye was on her. Every thought, every assumption, every hidden bias had just been laid bare in the most brutal, undeniable way possible. And Naomi wasn't about to let them forget it. She exhaled slowly, setting her champagne flute down on the nearest table, the delicate glass barely making a sound in the stillness of the room. Then, with deliberate ease, she took a step forward, her presence alone enough to make some of the guests visibly shrink. "It's funny," she began, her voice smooth but sharp, "how quickly people assume things when they see someone who doesn't look like them." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down at their drinks, pretending not to hear, as if ignoring her words would somehow erase the shame curling in their chests. Naomi, however, was not finished. She took another step forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor, the sound ringing louder than any of their judgment ever had. "You all looked at me tonight and made your decisions." She let the words hang, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of those who had whispered, those who had smirked, those who had dismissed her before even knowing who she was. "You didn't see a successful woman. You didn't see the owner of this mansion. You didn't see someone who worked hard to build something extraordinary." A man near the bar swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his glass. Naomi's expression didn't waver. "Instead, you saw what you wanted to see. You saw a stranger, an outsider, someone who, in your minds, had no right to be here." The words landed heavily, slicing through the air like a knife through velvet. The shame was palpable now, a living, breathing presence woven into the very fabric of the night. Naomi's voice softened, but the power in it remained unshaken. "I don't say this because I'm angry. I say this because it's not just about tonight. It's about every room like this. Every space where people judge before they listen, assume before they understand, and dismiss before they even know the truth." A chill ran through the crowd because deep down, they knew she was right. "So tell me." Naomi took a final step forward, her gaze locking onto some of the guests who had laughed at her earlier. "How does it feel to be the ones who don't belong now?" The room shuddered in the wake of her words, and this time no one dared to look away. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Then, a man near the center of the room, a CEO whose face had been plastered across Forbes magazine more times than he could count, cleared his throat. His face was tight with discomfort, but his voice was steady. "Ms. Carter, I owe you an apology." Naomi raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He shifted awkwardly, clearly out of his depth. I made assumptions tonight, and I was wrong." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as a few other guests nodded slowly, some even taking hesitant steps forward. "I judged you unfairly. I should have known better. That was incredibly wrong of us." The apologies were genuine, if not slightly hesitant, but Naomi could tell that for some, this was a moment of actual self-reflection. But then, of course, there were the others, the ones who still clung to their pride, who refused to acknowledge the deep, undeniable humiliation of what had just happened. A small cluster of elite socialites, including the very women who had whispered about Naomi earlier, lifted their chins, their expressions stony. One of them, a blonde with diamond-studded earrings and an icy glare, huffed softly and muttered, "This has turned ridiculous." Another, a man in an expensive suit and an ego just as oversized, scoffed under his breath. "Honestly, I don't see why this is such a big deal." Without another word, they turned on their heels and walked out. A few others followed suit, their movements stiff, their backs ramrod straight, their refusal to acknowledge their own failure so blatant that it only made them look smaller. Naomi watched them go, but she didn't chase after their understanding. Let them leave. She wasn't here to convince people to respect her. She was here to stand in her power. And the ones who truly understood that, they were the only ones worth keeping around. The atmosphere shifted after that. The tension in the air, once suffocating, began to dissolve. Guests who had once stood at a distance now approached Naomi genuinely, engaging her in conversation, wanting to know more about her story, her journey, her success. The energy of the night transformed, from a cold, exclusive gathering meant to showcase status, into something that actually felt real. Naomi, at last, allowed herself to relax. She laughed, sipped champagne, and engaged with people who saw her for more than just their first impression. She found herself gravitating toward a small group, old friends and a few new ones, the people who hadn't doubted her, who had stood beside her even when the rest of the room had turned against her. The orchestra played on, the music now feeling more vibrant, more alive than before. And Naomi? She danced. She laughed. She reclaimed the night as her own. Because in the end, the best revenge wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was living so well that those who doubted you had no choice but to watch you shine. And as Naomi stood in the center of the grand ballroom of her own mansion, surrounded by people who truly valued her, she realized something. She had never needed their approval in the first place. The morning after the Gala turn scandal, Naomi woke up to the buzzing chaos of her phone vibrating relentlessly on her nightstand. She groggily reached for it, eyes barely adjusted to the morning light, but the moment she saw the notifications flooding in, any remnants of sleep vanished instantly. Her name was everywhere. Front-page headlines, social media trends, news channels running back-to-back coverage. She opened her Twitter app, and her mentions were on fire. Y'all, the audacity of these elites trying to throw out Naomi Carter from her own home? The irony is eating me alive. That moment when Naomi hit them with, "You are guests in my home." Pure cinema. Victoria Lancaster is finished. That level of humiliation? She's not coming back from that. Naomi let out a slow exhale, scrolling through countless posts, memes, and articles dissecting the night in painstaking detail. Major news outlets had jumped on the scandal immediately, their headlines merciless. CNN breaking, Silicon Valley mogul Naomi Carter faces prejudice at high society gala, and then delivers the ultimate power move. Forbes, billionaire Naomi Carter schools the elites. A masterclass in humility and karma. The New York Times, real estate queen Victoria Lancaster publicly humiliated. Will she ever recover? Naomi couldn't help but smirk. The very same people who had mocked her, doubted her, dismissed her, they were now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. And Victoria? Oh, Victoria was in freefall. At the same time Naomi was waking up to waves of public support, Victoria Lancaster was having the worst morning of her career. Her phone rang non-stop, but she ignored every call, staring at the glowing red numbers on her laptop screen in absolute horror. Her company, Lancaster Realty, was bleeding. Stock price, minus 18% in pre-market trading. Major investors withdrawing funding. High-profile clients canceling contracts. Luxury developers dropping her firm from multimillion-dollar projects. Victoria gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the edge of her desk so tightly that her nails dug into the polished wood. The headlines were brutal. Lancaster Realty in crisis. CEO Victoria Lancaster faces backlash after public disgrace. Victoria Lancaster, from real estate icon to social pariah overnight. Will Lancaster Realty survive the fallout of its CEO's biggest blunder? She reached for her phone and finally answered one of the dozens of calls. Victoria. Her publicist's voice was sharp, urgent, and merciless. What the hell were you thinking? Victoria squeezed her eyes shut, her jaw locking. No, don't talk. Just listen. Her publicist didn't let her breathe. This is a full-blown PR catastrophe. Clients are pulling out. Your stock is tanking. If you don't act fast, you're going to lose everything. Victoria inhaled sharply, her pride battling against the raw reality slamming into her. This wasn't something she could control. For years, she had wielded power through influence, wealth, and reputation. But now, none of that could protect her. Because this wasn't just a business scandal. This was personal. Her name was synonymous with arrogance, elitism, and disgrace, and no amount of money could buy her way out of it. While Victoria was watching her empire crumble, Naomi was watching hers expand. Her email inbox was exploding with new opportunities. Partnership offers from high-profile brands. Investment firms reaching out, eager to work with her. Invitations to elite panels, conferences, and events she had never been considered for before. People who had once ignored her were now begging to be in her orbit. Her assistant, Ava, practically burst into her office, waving a stack of requests in her hand. Naomi, you're going to want to see this. Naomi arched an eyebrow, accepting the papers as Ava rattled off names. Vogue wants an exclusive interview. Harvard Business School is asking you to speak at their next leadership summit. Netflix is considering a documentary on your rise in Silicon Valley. Naomi leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, letting the sheer magnitude of it all sink in. Not long ago, these same people had seen her as invisible. Now, they couldn't get enough of her. The irony was delicious, but Naomi didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate Victoria's downfall. Because unlike Victoria, Naomi had never needed to step on others to succeed. Her success had always been on her own terms. And now the world was finally paying attention. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Naomi stood on the balcony of her mansion, gazing out at the sprawling view of Beverly Hills. The night breeze was cool, carrying the faint hum of Los Angeles beneath her feet. She held a glass of wine, twirling the stem between her fingers as she let the events of the past 24 hours wash over her. She had walked into that gala underestimated. She had walked out of it untouchable. Naomi took a slow sip of her wine, savoring the moment, the justice, the satisfaction. She didn't need to chase revenge. She didn't need to destroy Victoria. Karma had already done it for her. And as Naomi watched the city lights twinkle beneath her, she smiled. Because in the end, she had always known the truth. Karma never misses, and tonight it had found its mark.